It was supposed to be a surprise. 2 days ahead of schedule, an early return from the grueling overseas work assignment I'd been stuck on for weeks. I'd pictured it perfectly, Gracie's face lighting up when she opened the door, our daughter Molly jumping into my arms, her tiny voice squealing, "Daddy." The image carried me through countless sleepless nights and lonely hotel rooms. The clock read 1:07 a.m. as I pulled into our driveway. But instead of a warm glow from the living room window or a welcoming silence from a sleeping home, I was greeted by something else entirely: Dean Carter's car parked outside. Dean. That name alone felt like sandpaper against my nerves. He was an old friend of Gracie's, though friend always felt like too soft a word for whatever their connection was. He was the guy who always lingered too long, laughed too hard at her jokes, and somehow found reasons to show up whenever I wasn't around. I'd told myself 100 times that I was being paranoid, that Gracie wouldn't do something like that. But seeing his car in my driveway in the middle of the night, my stomach dropped. For a minute, I sat there in the dark cab of my car, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. My breath came in short, sharp bursts, and my ears were ringing. But then I forced myself to move. I wasn't going to sit there all night, torturing myself with thoughts of what might be happening inside my own home. The front door was unlocked. That detail stuck out to me, like they hadn't even thought to cover their tracks. I stepped inside, closing the door quietly behind me. The house was mostly dark except for a faint light spilling out from the living room. And that's where I found them. Gracie was curled up on the couch, wearing nothing but one of my old t-shirts, barely covering her. Dean sat next to her, shirtless, his arm casually draped across the back of the couch. Their faces were close together, and Gracie was laughing softly at something he'd said. It was the kind of laugh she used to reserve just for me. Neither of them noticed me at first. I stood there, frozen, staring at the woman I'd built my life with and the man I'd always had a bad feeling about. Something inside me cracked, no, shattered. But on the outside, I stayed still. Calm. "Enjoying yourselves?" I asked, my voice low but steady. Gracie's head snapped toward me, her eyes wide with shock and guilt. Dean's face went pale. He moved his arm away from her like it was suddenly on fire. Gracie scrambled to sit up straighter, clutching the hem of the t-shirt like it was some kind of shield. "Leon," she whispered. You're home early." "No kidding." My eyes locked onto Dean. "You should probably leave. Now." Dean, to his credit, or maybe just out of sheer cowardice, didn't argue. He grabbed his shirt off the armrest and stumbled to his feet. He muttered something that might have been an apology, but I didn't care enough to listen. I followed him to the door, watching as he rushed out into the night, his car screeching as he sped away. When I turned back, Gracie was still on the couch, knees pulled to her chest, tears streaming down her face. For a few seconds, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, suffocating. "Leon," she started again, her voice trembling. "Where's Molly?" I asked, cutting her off. "She's asleep," Gracie said softly. "She doesn't know anything." I made sure of that. That was the only sliver of relief I felt in that moment. At least Molly hadn't seen any of this. I sighed, running a hand through my hair. My wedding ring caught the faint light from the lamp, and for a second, I felt like it was burning my skin. "How long has this been going on?" I asked, my voice flat. Gracie hesitated, her eyes flickering away from mine. "A month." "It's only been a month, Leon. I was lonely. You were gone, and I was." "Stop." I held up a hand, and she fell silent. "I don't want to hear excuses. Not right now." For the first time since walking into the house, I let my anger show. Not in yelling or smashing things, just a sharp edge to my voice that made Gracie flinch. "I'm going to check on Molly," I said quietly. "We'll talk about this tomorrow." And with that, I turned and walked upstairs, leaving Gracie alone on the couch. As I pushed open Molly's bedroom door and saw her small peaceful face resting on her pillow, a lump formed in my throat. I knelt beside her bed and brushed a strand of hair away from her forehead. "Daddy's home, sweetheart," I whispered. "Everything's going to be okay." But as I sat there in the dark, the truth settled over me like a cold, wet blanket. I had no idea if that was true. The morning sunlight crept through the blinds, sharp and intrusive. I hadn't slept, not even for a second. I spent the night in the armchair in Molly's room, watching her sleep, listening to the faint hum of the baby monitor. At some point, she stirred, yawned, and rubbed her eyes before spotting me in the corner. "Daddy," she chirped, her little arms reaching out. I managed a smile, even though my chest felt like it was caving in. I scooped her up, pressing a kiss against her temple. "Morning, Peanut," I said softly. "Are you staying home today?" she asked, her voice filled with innocent hope. "Yeah, sweetheart. I'm staying home." We went downstairs together, Molly chattering away about her favorite cartoon and her plans for the day. Her voice was the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. When we walked into the kitchen, Gracie was already there, sitting at the table with a mug of coffee in her hands. Her eyes were red and puffy, dark circles etched beneath them. She looked fragile, but I didn't let myself feel sorry for her. "Morning, Mommy," Molly said cheerfully, oblivious to the thick tension hanging in the air. Gracie tried to smile. "Good morning, baby. Did you sleep well?" I didn't say a word as I set Molly down at the table and started making her breakfast. My hands were steady as I cracked eggs into a skillet, but inside, I was unraveling. Every movement Gracie made in my peripheral vision felt like a nail being driven into my chest. "Leon," Gracie started, her voice low. "Not now," I said, not looking at her. She flinched, but I didn't care. Not in front of Molly. I sat with Molly as she ate, answering her endless questions about my work trip and whether I'd brought her any souvenirs. I had, of course, a stuffed koala that I gave her after breakfast. She was over the moon, clutching it tightly as she ran off to play in the living room. Finally, it was just me and Gracie in the kitchen. Silence settled in, heavy and unrelenting. "You wanted to talk?" I said, finally turning to face her. She nodded, swallowing hard. "Leon, I'm so sorry. I never meant for this to happen." "Never meant for what to happen, Gracie?" I asked, my voice cold. "For me to find out? For me to walk in on you and Dean on our couch?" She winced. "It wasn't supposed to go this far. I was lonely. You were gone for so long, and Dean was just there." I let out a sharp breath, running a hand through my hair. "Lonely? Gracie, I was working halfway across the world to provide for this, for us. For you and Molly." "I know," she whispered, tears filling her eyes. "I know. And I hate myself for it. I hate what I did to you, to us." I stared at her, trying to find something, anything, in her face that felt familiar. But all I saw was someone I didn't recognize. "How long has this been going on?" I asked again. "A month," she said quietly. I shook my head. "A month. 30 days. Do you know how long that is, Gracie? How many chances you had to stop, to realize what you were doing and walk away?" Her head dropped, and a tear splashed onto the table. "I'm so sorry, Leon." I leaned back in my chair, crossing my arms over my chest. "Did Molly ever see him here?" Gracie's head snapped up. "No. Leon, I would never let that happen. I promise you, she never saw anything." I believed her. But it didn't make me feel any better. "What happens now?" she asked softly, her voice trembling. I didn't have an answer for her. I didn't know what happened now. All I knew was that I couldn't look at her without seeing Dean's smug face in my mind, couldn't sit on that couch without picturing the two of them tangled together. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice cracking. "But for now, I'm staying in the guest room. And I need space, Gracie. A lot of it." She nodded, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. We sat there in silence for a few more minutes before I stood up and walked out of the kitchen. I found Molly in the living room, playing with her new koala, her face lit up with joy. "Daddy, look. He's dancing," she giggled, holding the stuffed toy in her tiny hands. I knelt down beside her, my throat tight. "That's amazing, Peanut. You're such a good dancer." I stayed there with her, letting her innocent laughter wash over me like a bomb. But in the back of my mind, one question kept gnawing at me, clawing at the edges of my sanity. How do you come back from something like this? I spent the afternoon in the guest room. The walls felt closer together than I remembered, and the air was heavy with the scent of old fabric softener. Gracie knocked softly on the door around lunchtime. "Leon, I made you something to eat. I'm not hungry." She lingered for a moment before I heard her footsteps retreat down the hall. I stared at the ceiling, my mind replaying last night on a loop. Dean's smirk. Gracie's guilty expression. Her wearing my t-shirt like some sick joke. A soft knock broke the silence again. "Daddy." "Molly." I opened the door, forcing a smile. "Hey, Peanut. Are you mad at Mommy?" she asked, her little eyebrows scrunched together. I crouched down to her level, my chest tight. "No, sweetheart. Mommy and I just need some time to talk, that's all." She nodded, accepting my answer without question. "Okay. Can we play tea party later?" "Of course," I said, managing a smile. As she skipped down the hall, I felt my heart crack a little more. Gracie had broken something sacred between us, and now I had to figure out how, or if, it could ever be fixed. Later that evening, I found myself sitting at the dining table with Molly across from me, her stuffed koala propped up next to her tiny teacup. She giggled as she poured me imaginary tea, her little fingers carefully holding the plastic kettle. "More tea, Daddy?" "Yes, please," I said, forcing a smile. Gracie stood in the doorway, watching us. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen. She looked like she wanted to say something, but she stayed silent. When Molly dashed off to grab more cookies for our tea party, Gracie stepped closer. "Leon, can we please talk tonight? After Molly's asleep." I nodded stiffly. "Yeah, we'll talk." She turned away, and I saw her shoulders shake as she walked back into the kitchen. That night, once Molly was asleep, I found Gracie sitting on the edge of our bed. The bed we'd shared for nearly a decade. "I know I don't deserve forgiveness," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "But I need you to know. I love you, Leon. I love our family. What I did was a mistake, one I'll regret for the rest of my life." I stayed by the door, arms crossed. "A mistake?" "Gracie, a mistake is forgetting to pick up milk at the store. What you did, it was a choice. Over and over again." She flinched but didn't argue. "I don't know if I can come back from this," I said, my voice cracking. "I don't know if we can come back from this." The silence hung heavy between us. "I'll do whatever it takes," she said, tears streaming down her face. I shook my head slowly. "I need time, Gracie. I need space." I turned and walked back to the guest room, shutting the door behind me. For the first time since this all started, I felt the weight of the betrayal settle deep in my chest, and it hurt more than I ever thought possible. Morning came heavy. I hadn't slept, again. I could hear faint sounds from the kitchen, dishes clinking, Molly's giggles, Gracie's soft voice. It felt normal, almost peaceful, and that made it hurt more. When I finally emerged, Molly was sitting at the kitchen island eating cereal, her face smeared with milk and chocolate. Gracie stood by the sink, her back to me. "Morning, Daddy." Molly beamed. "Morning, Peanut." I kissed the top of her head and grabbed a coffee mug. Gracie turned slightly, her eyes flickering up to meet mine before looking back down. "I made you coffee," she said quietly. I ignored her and poured my own. Molly swung her little legs under the stool. "Daddy, can we go to the park today?" I hesitated. Gracie turned around fully now, her voice careful. "I could take her if you need time to yourself." "No," I said quickly. "I'll take her." Gracie flinched but nodded, turning back to the sink. At the park, Molly raced across the playground, her laughter carried by the wind. I sat on a bench, watching her, my chest tight. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Dean's car in the driveway. I saw them on the couch. "Daddy, look." Molly called, balancing on a beam with her arms stretched wide. "You're doing great, Peanut." I forced a smile. A mom nearby glanced at me, then away. I wondered if people knew. Did they look at me and see a man whose wife had cheated on him? Did they see the cracks in my foundation? Molly skipped back over, clutching a dandelion. "Make a wish, Daddy." I took it from her, staring at the fragile yellow petals. I wish I could unsee it. I wish I could unfeel it. I wish I could trust her again. But I blew on the dandelion anyway, watching the tiny seeds scatter in the breeze. "Did your wish come true, Daddy?" I looked down at her bright, innocent face. "Not yet, sweetheart," I said softly. "Not yet." The drive home from the park was quiet. Molly had dozed off in the back seat, clutching her stuffed koala. I glanced at her in the rearview mirror, her face peaceful, her tiny chest rising and falling. When we pulled into the driveway, Gracie was waiting by the door. Her eyes met mine briefly before flicking down to the ground. She looked hollow. "She's asleep," I said, keeping my voice low. Gracie nodded and stepped aside as I carried Molly up to her room. I tucked her in, brushed a strand of hair away from her face, and kissed her forehead. Back downstairs, Gracie was still standing in the kitchen, her hands wrapped around a half-empty mug of tea. "Did she have fun?" she asked softly. "Yeah." Silence. Heavy, suffocating silence. "Leon. I can't undo what I did," she said, her voice trembling. "But I need to know if you're even open to trying. To us." I looked at her, really looked at her. She was pale, her shoulders slumped forward, her eyes hollow and rimmed with red. But all I could see was him. Dean. His car. His arm around her. "I don't know, Gracie." My voice was flat, tired. "I don't know if I can forgive you." Tears welled in her eyes, and she nodded slowly, as if she'd expected that answer. "Okay," she whispered. I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her there, clutching her mug like it was the only thing holding her together. Upstairs, I shut the guest room door behind me and sat on the edge of the bed, head in my hands. The cracks between us were growing deeper, and I had no idea if they could ever be filled. The days blurred together. I stayed in the guest room, avoiding Gracie as much as possible. We communicated in short, hollow exchanges, mostly about Molly. "Can you pick her up from school today?" "Yeah." "She needs a new pair of sneakers." "I'll handle it." Every conversation felt like stepping over shattered glass, careful, deliberate, and painful no matter how light our steps. One evening, I was helping Molly with her homework at the dining table when Gracie walked in, drying her hands with a dish towel. "Leon, can we talk later?" she asked softly. Molly looked up, her pencil frozen mid-air. I nodded once. "After Molly's asleep." That night, I found Gracie in the living room. She was sitting on the same couch where I'd found her with Dean. I hesitated in the doorway before finally stepping inside. "I hate this distance between us," she started, her voice shaking. "I hate that I can't fix this, that I've hurt you so deeply. But Leon, I need to know, do you still love me?" The question hung heavy in the air. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. Did I love her? Or did I love the version of her I thought I knew, the version of our marriage I thought we had? "I don't know," I said honestly. "I don't know if I love you, or if I just love what we used to be." Her face crumpled, and she covered her mouth with her hand to muffle a sob. "I'm trying, Leon," she whispered. "I'll do whatever it takes. Therapy, counseling, whatever you need. Please, just don't shut me out completely." I sighed, running a hand down my face. "I can't promise anything, Gracie. But I'll think about it." She nodded through her tears, clutching the throw pillow against her chest like it might keep her from falling apart. I stood there for a moment, watching her cry, before I turned and walked back to the guest room. Every step away from her felt heavier than the last. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of bacon and coffee. For a split second, it felt normal, like before. But then reality slammed back into me. I found Gracie in the kitchen, flipping pancakes while Molly sat at the table, swinging her legs and humming to herself. "Morning, Daddy." Molly chirped, her face sticky with syrup. "Morning, Peanut." Gracie glanced over her shoulder. "I made breakfast, if you're hungry." I hesitated. For days, I'd been eating separately, retreating to the guest room or sneaking into the kitchen when no one was around. But Molly was watching me with those big, hopeful eyes, and I couldn't bear to disappoint her. "Thanks," I said stiffly, sitting down across from Molly. Gracie placed a plate in front of me, pancakes, bacon, eggs. The kind of breakfast she used to make on Sunday mornings when things were good. For a while, the three of us sat there in silence, the only sounds coming from Molly's excited chatter about school and her stuffed koala's adventures. When breakfast was over, Gracie started cleaning up, her back to me as she scrubbed the dishes. "Leon," she said softly without turning around. "Yeah. Would you consider going to counseling with me?" I froze. "I know it won't fix everything overnight," she continued. "But maybe it's a start?" Molly came running back into the room before I could respond, holding her koala in one hand and a crayon drawing in the other. "Daddy, look. I drew us." She showed me the picture, 3 stick figures holding hands under a bright yellow sun. Me, Gracie, and her. A perfect little family. I swallowed hard, my chest tightening. "Daddy." Gracie's voice was almost a whisper now. I looked up at her, and for a moment I saw the woman I married, the woman I used to trust with every part of me. "I'll think about it," I said quietly. Gracie nodded, her lips trembling as she turned back to the sink. Molly tugged on my arm. "Come on, Daddy. Let's go play." I let her pull me away, but as I followed her to the living room, I couldn't stop thinking about Gracie's question. Could counseling really fix this? Could anything? That night, after Molly was tucked into bed and the house fell quiet, I sat in the guest room staring at the ceiling. Gracie's question about counseling kept bouncing around in my head, refusing to settle. Could I sit in a room with her, week after week, and dig through the rubble of what we used to be? Could I look her in the eyes and talk about him without breaking something, whether it was her, myself, or whatever fragile thread was holding us together? I didn't have an answer. Around midnight, there was a soft knock on the door. Leon. Gracie's voice was barely above a whisper. I sighed, rubbing my face before opening the door. She stood there in her robe, her hair pulled back, looking small and fragile. "Can I come in?" I hesitated but stepped aside. She perched on the edge of the guest room bed, her hands clasped in her lap. For a few moments, neither of us said anything. "Did you think about what I said earlier?" she asked softly. I nodded. "Yeah. I thought about it. And I don't know, Gracie. I don't know if counseling will fix this. I don't know if anything will fix this." She flinched, but she didn't look away. "I know it won't erase what I did. I know it won't make you forget, or even forgive me. But maybe it could help us understand why it happened. Maybe it could help us move forward, together or not." Her voice cracked on that last word, and something twisted in my chest. "Why, Gracie?" I said suddenly, my voice sharp. "Why him? Why Dean? Of all people, why someone you knew I didn't trust? Someone who's been sniffing around you for years?" She swallowed hard, tears pooling in her eyes. "I don't have a good answer, Leon. I wish I did. I was lonely and he was there, and I let it happen. I let it happen more than once. And every single time, I hated myself. But I couldn't stop." Her voice cracked again, and she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking. I looked away, my jaw clenched so tight it hurt. "You weren't the only one who was lonely, Gracie," I said finally. "I was on the other side of the world, missing you and Molly every single day. And you were here with him." She didn't say anything, just sat there, her face still buried in her hands. The room felt suffocating. Every word spoken felt like another nail in the coffin of our marriage. After what felt like hours, Gracie lifted her head, her face streaked with tears. "Leon, do you still want this? Us? Do you want to try?" I stared at her, searching for an answer in my own heart, but all I found was exhaustion. "I don't know, Gracie. I don't know." She nodded, her face crumpling again. "I'll sleep on the couch tonight," she said quietly, standing up. "No," I said quickly. "You can stay in our room. I'll stay here." She paused, looking like she wanted to argue, but then she nodded and walked to the door. Before she left, she turned back to me. "I love you, Leon. Even if you never believe me again, I love you." When the door closed behind her, I let out a breath I didn't realize I was holding. The next morning, I woke up to sunlight filtering through the guest room blinds. I hadn't slept much, but it didn't matter. I felt hollow. Downstairs, I found Gracie in the kitchen again. She looked over her shoulder at me and opened her mouth to say something, but then she stopped herself and turned back to the stove. Molly was sitting at the table with her koala, drawing a picture with bright crayons. She looked up and grinned when she saw me. "Daddy, Mommy said we can go to the zoo this weekend. Can we? Please?" Gracie froze at the stove, her shoulders tense as she waited for my answer. I forced a smile. "Yeah, Peanut. We'll go to the zoo." Molly cheered, holding her koala up like it was celebrating too. Gracie turned slightly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Leon." I didn't respond. Later that afternoon, while Molly was napping, I walked into the kitchen where Gracie was wiping down the counter. "Set up the counseling," I said abruptly. She froze, her eyes wide as she turned to face me. "Really?" "Yes. But, Gracie, I'm not promising anything. I'm not promising forgiveness. I'm not promising we'll come out of this okay. But I'll try. That's all I can give you right now." Tears spilled down her cheeks as she nodded. "That's enough, Leon. That's enough." I turned and walked away before the weight of it all could crush me. It wasn't a resolution. It wasn't even a step toward healing. But it was something. And for now, something was all I had to give. The waiting room smelled like lavender and stale coffee. Gracie sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her knee bouncing slightly. I stared at a framed picture of a mountain landscape on the wall, wondering how many other broken couples had sat in these same chairs, surrounded by the same cheap art, hoping for answers they might never find. Leon. Gracie's voice was soft, hesitant. I turned to her. She looked fragile, like she might shatter if I said the wrong thing. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. The door opened, and a woman in her 50s with a warm smile and a clipboard stepped out. "Leon, Gracie? Come on in." The counselor's office was cozy, bookshelves filled with self-help titles and framed diplomas, 2 couches facing each other, a box of tissues within arm's reach. "Please, make yourselves comfortable," she said, settling into her chair. "I'm Dr. Myers. I know this isn't easy, but you're here, and that's a big first step." Gracie sat on one end of the couch, and I sat on the other. The space between us felt like a canyon. Dr. Myers folded her hands and looked between us. "Gracie, Leon, why don't we start with why you're here today? What do you both hope to get out of these sessions?" Gracie spoke first, her voice trembling. "I want to fix this. I want to fix us. I know I can't undo what I did, but I love Leon, and I love our family. I'll do whatever it takes to earn back his trust." Her eyes flickered toward me, but I kept mine fixed on the floor. "Leon," Dr. Myers prompted gently. I swallowed hard. "I'm here because I don't want to make a decision I'll regret. I don't know if this can be fixed. I don't know if I can forgive her. But I'm here because I need to know I tried." Dr. Myers nodded thoughtfully. "That's an honest answer, Leon. And honesty is a good place to start. The first session was brutal." Gracie cried. I stayed mostly silent, speaking only when Dr. Myers pushed me to. "Leon, when you found out about the affair, what did you feel in that moment?" "Like the ground disappeared beneath me," I said quietly. "Like everything I thought I knew about my wife, my home, my family, was a lie." Gracie let out a quiet sob, her hand over her mouth. "And Gracie," Dr. Myers said, turning to her, "what were you hoping to find in your relationship with Dean?" Gracie hesitated, her face pale. I wasn't looking for anything. I was lonely. I felt invisible. And Dean, he made me feel seen." The words felt like another knife to the chest. I clenched my jaw, looking away. Dr. Myers noticed. "Leon, what are you feeling right now?" "Angry," I said bluntly. "Because I was working myself to the bone for her, for us. And she felt invisible? That's hard for me to understand." Gracie broke down again, burying her face in her hands. Dr. Myers sighed softly. "This is going to be hard. There will be moments like this, moments where it feels impossible to move forward. But if you're both willing to keep showing up, we can start to untangle this mess, piece by piece." The ride home was silent. Gracie stared out the passenger window, her eyes red and swollen. When we pulled into the driveway, she finally spoke. "Thank you for coming, Leon. I know it's hard. I know. I don't deserve this chance." I stared straight ahead at the garage door. "I'm not doing this for you, Gracie. I'm doing this for Molly. And maybe for me too." She nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying again, and slipped out of the car. That night, after Molly was in bed, I sat on the couch, the same couch where everything had come crashing down. Gracie came in, hesitating in the doorway. "Can I sit?" she asked. I nodded. She sat at the far end, clutching a pillow to her chest. Do you hate me, Leon?" The question hung heavy in the air. I didn't answer right away. "No," I said finally. "I don't hate you. But I don't know if I love you either. Right now. I'm just trying to breathe." She nodded, tears silently spilling down her cheeks. We sat there in silence, the space between us feeling impossibly wide. The path ahead was unclear, and the weight of everything felt suffocating. But for now, we were still sitting in the same room. Still trying, whatever that meant. The days after our first counseling session were tense but quiet. Gracie seemed to tiptoe around me, her movements careful, her words measured. I avoided eye contact most of the time, afraid I'd see her guilt, or worse, her regret, and snap. One evening, after putting Molly to bed, I found myself in the kitchen pouring a glass of water. Gracie walked in, hesitating in the doorway. "Leon, I wanted to thank you for trying." I didn't respond, just nodded and turned to leave. "Wait," she said softly. Can I show you something?" I paused, hand on the doorway. "What is it?" She reached into a drawer and pulled out a small, crumpled notebook. "I've been writing in this. Everything I feel, everything I regret. About us, about what I did." She held it out to me, her hands trembling. I stared at it for a moment before finally taking it. "I don't expect you to read it now. Or ever. But I wanted you to know I'm trying to understand how I hurt you. And myself." I nodded again, clutching the notebook tightly. As I walked back to the guest room, I sat on the edge of the bed and stared down at it. I didn't open it. Not yet. But I didn't throw it away either. It sat on the nightstand, a fragile thread between us. One I wasn't ready to pull on just yet. The days settled into a strange, fragile routine. Mornings with Molly felt like holding on to the last bit of warmth before stepping into the cold. Evenings were quiet, heavy with unspoken words. Gracie and I existed in the same space, but it felt like we were separated by an invisible wall. One afternoon, I came home early from work. Molly was coloring at the kitchen table, her brows furrowed in concentration. Gracie was at the sink, scrubbing dishes with an intensity that felt off. "Hey, Peanut," I said, ruffling Molly's hair. "What are you drawing?" "The family picture," she said proudly, holding up her drawing. It was us, 3 stick figures holding hands, but there was a 4th figure in the background. A taller man, drawn in gray crayon. My stomach tightened. "Who's that, sweetheart?" Molly hesitated. "That's Mr. Dean. He came over sometimes when you were gone." Gracie froze at the sink. Her hands stopped scrubbing, water running over her fingers. I nodded slowly, forcing a smile. "It's a very nice drawing, Molly. Why don't you go pick a movie for us to watch tonight?" She squealed with excitement and ran to the living room. The second she was out of earshot, I turned to Gracie. Why was he around Molly? Gracie turned off the water and gripped the edge of the sink, her knuckles white. "Leon. I swear, nothing happened when she was here. He only came by a few times, and she was never." She remembered him, Gracie. She drew him in our family picture. That's how much she noticed. Her shoulders shook as she silently cried, her head hanging low. "I messed up, Leon. I messed up so badly." I wanted to scream, to punch a hole in the wall, to demand answers she couldn't possibly give me. But instead I just whispered, "You put him near our daughter, Gracie. That's something I don't know if I can ever forgive." I turned and walked out of the kitchen, leaving her standing there, trembling. That night, I sat on the couch with Molly, watching her favorite cartoon. She leaned her head on my arm, her little voice singing along with the theme song. For a moment, I closed my eyes and tried to block everything else out. But Gracie's tear-streaked face and Molly's gray crayon drawing wouldn't leave my mind. The image of Molly's crayon drawing haunted me all night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that gray stick figure, Dean, looming in the background of our family. The next morning, I was already awake when Gracie knocked softly on the guest room door. "Leon, can we talk?" I opened the door, stepping out into the hallway so we wouldn't wake Molly. Gracie stood there in her robe, her eyes red and swollen from crying. "Why was he here, Gracie?" I asked flatly. Why was Dean anywhere near our daughter? She flinched, clutching the robe tightly around her. He stopped by a couple of times. He'd bring coffee, and we'd sit and talk. It was nothing physical when Molly was here. I swear on my life, Leon. But he was here, Gracie. In our home. Around her. And now she remembers him, draws him in our family pictures. How do you not see how wrong that is? Tears spilled down her cheeks. I know it was wrong. I know. But I didn't think. That's the problem, Gracie. You didn't think. You let a man into our home while our daughter was here, a man you were sleeping with. She broke down, covering her face with her hands. I wanted to feel something other than anger, sympathy, pity, anything. But all I felt was cold. I need space, I said finally. More than just the guest room. I'm going to take Molly to my parents' place for a few days. Gracie's head snapped up. Leon, please, don't take her away from me. I'm not taking her away, Gracie. I'm giving myself time to think. To breathe. And I need her with me because she's the only thing keeping me sane right now. She reached out like she wanted to touch my arm, but I stepped back. Her face crumpled, and she nodded slowly. Molly was thrilled when I told her we were going on a mini vacation to Grandma and Grandpa's house. I packed a few bags while Gracie hovered in the background, wringing her hands but saying nothing. At the door, she knelt in front of Molly, hugging her tightly. "Be good for Daddy, okay? I love you so much, baby." "I love you too, Mommy," Molly said, her little arms wrapped tightly around Gracie's neck. Gracie stood up, her eyes meeting mine. "Please, Leon. Please come back." I didn't respond. I just nodded and led Molly out the door. The drive to my parents' house was long and quiet. Molly fell asleep in the back seat, her stuffed koala clutched tightly in her arms. When we arrived, my mom opened the door with her usual warm smile. "Leon." "Molly." "Oh, come here, sweetheart." Molly squealed as Grandma scooped her up and spun her around. "Where's Gracie?" Mom asked softly once Molly ran inside to play with Grandpa. "She's at home," I said, my voice tight. Mom studied my face, her smile fading. "Come inside. You look like you need to talk." Later that night, after Molly was tucked into bed in my old childhood room, I sat at the kitchen table with my parents. My dad was nursing a cup of black coffee, while Mom sat across from me, her hands folded tightly on the table. "Gracie cheated on me," I said quietly. The words felt heavy, like I was admitting to some terrible failure. Mom's hand flew to her mouth, her eyes filling with tears. Dad's jaw tightened, and he stared into his coffee mug. "Oh, Leon," Mom whispered. "And it was with Dean Carter," I added. "You remember him, right? The guy I always felt uneasy about?" Turns out my gut was right. My dad set his mug down with a sharp clink. "That son of a..." "Dad," I said firmly. "Please." He pressed his lips into a thin line, nodding tightly. I told them everything, about coming home early, finding them on the couch, the counseling, Molly's drawing. By the time I finished, the kitchen was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. "Do you want to leave her?" Mom asked softly. I stared down at my hands, my wedding ring catching the kitchen light. "I don't know. Part of me wants to pack up everything and never look back. But another part of me doesn't. I still see her as the woman I fell in love with, the mother of my child. And I hate myself for still caring." "There's no shame in caring, son," Dad said gruffly. "But you can't force yourself to forgive her if you're not ready. And you sure as hell can't let her sweep this under the rug." Mom reached across the table and squeezed my hand. "Whatever you decide, Leon, we'll support you. But you need to take the time to figure out what you want, not what's easiest, or what's best for appearances. What you want." I nodded, my throat tight. "Thanks, Mom." "Thanks, Dad." That night, I lay on the pull-out couch in the living room, staring at the ceiling. Molly was safe, sleeping soundly upstairs. But my mind wouldn't rest. I thought about our wedding day, Gracie in her white dress, her smile so bright it felt like the sun. I thought about the day Molly was born, how we both cried when we held her for the first time. But then I thought about Dean. About Gracie on the couch, wearing my shirt while Dean sat beside her. The memories clashed in my head, fighting for space, and I couldn't tell which ones were real anymore. I rolled over and stared at my phone on the nightstand. A single notification from Gracie sat there. "I miss you. Please come home." I turned the phone face down and closed my eyes. I didn't have an answer yet. But I knew one thing for sure, whatever decision I made would change everything the next morning. I woke up to the sound of Molly's laughter upstairs. My mom was helping her with breakfast, and for a brief moment, everything felt normal. But normal didn't last long. When I checked my phone, there was another text from Gracie. "Can we talk? Please, Leon. I'm falling apart." I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button. But I couldn't bring myself to type anything. "Morning, son." My dad's voice broke my thoughts. He stood in the doorway, coffee mug in hand. "Morning, Dad." He sat down across from me, his eyes sharp but kind. "You don't have to respond yet. But eventually you'll have to face it, one way or another." I nodded, but I couldn't shake the image of Gracie's tear-streaked face or the sound of her voice cracking when she begged me not to leave. Later, while Molly napped, I stepped outside into the crisp air. My phone was still in my hand, and before I could talk myself out of it, I dialed Gracie's number. She answered on the first ring. "Leon." Her voice was raw, like she'd been crying. "We'll talk," I said quietly. "When I get back. But Gracie, don't expect answers from me yet. "That's enough," she whispered. "That's all I need right now." I hung up and sat down on the porch steps, my head in my hands. The road ahead felt impossible, and I wasn't sure if I had the strength to walk it. 2 days later, Molly and I drove back home. The closer we got, the tighter my chest felt. Every mile felt like a countdown to something I wasn't ready for. When we pulled into the driveway, Gracie was waiting on the porch. She looked exhausted, her face pale, hair pulled into a messy bun. She gave Molly a shaky smile as our daughter launched herself out of the car and into her arms. "Mommy." "Hi, baby," Gracie whispered, holding her tightly. I grabbed our bags from the trunk, and when I walked up the steps, Gracie's eyes met mine. They were filled with so many emotions: hope, fear, guilt, love. I looked away first. That night, after Molly was asleep, Gracie and I sat in the living room. The same living room where everything had shattered. "I need to say this," Gracie started, her voice trembling. "Leon, I know I can't undo what I did. I can't erase the hurt, the betrayal. But I want you to know that I'm here. Whether you stay, whether you leave, I'll keep trying to make this right. I'll keep showing up." I stared at her, my heart feeling like it was being pulled in 2 different directions. "Do you still love me, Leon?" she asked softly. I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. "I don't know if I loved this version of you, Gracie. But I loved the woman I married. I loved the mother of my child. And I think there's still something here. Something worth saving." Tears streamed down her face, and she nodded, her lip trembling. "But this isn't going to be easy," I continued. "It's going to take time, and you need to understand, I might not ever fully forgive you. And if I can't, I'll walk away. But I'm willing to try. For Molly. And maybe, for us." Gracie broke down, covering her face with her hands. I sat there, staring at her, feeling hollow and heavy all at once. When she finally looked up, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Thank you, Leon." That night, I didn't go back to the guest room. I didn't go back to our bedroom either. I sat on the couch until the early hours of the morning, staring at nothing, trying to piece together fragments of a broken marriage. This wasn't a fairy tale ending. There were no promises, no neat resolutions. Just 2 people standing on opposite sides of a canyon, trying to build a bridge 1 plank at a time. I didn't know if we'd make it to the other side. But for now, I was willing to try.